Hello viewers, this is Angela Murjani from Kasturba Gandhi College in Secunderabad, and I welcome you to today's lesson, which is a most unusual idea that the poet Walt Whitman explores in one of his most famous poems. Walt Whitman was an American poet from the 19th century who began his career as an apprentice with a printer. From there, he moved on to becoming a school teacher and after that established his own printing press. As the owner of a newspaper, he was able to consolidate his career in writing and very soon had written enough poems to publish a compiled version of them in 1885, which was called Leaves of Grass. This particular book elicited a very strong reaction from the American public. There were people who loved him and praised his poetry, and there were also those who hated it, and he came in for a great deal of condemnation. However, undeterred by the condemnation, Whitman continued to write poem after poem, which he added in new editions of his volume Leaves of Grass. A noiseless, patient spider, which is the poem that we are going to be doing today, may be found in this compilation. It is a lyric poem of 10 lines, which is written in free verse. Free verse means that there is no particular metrical scheme that has been utilized by the poet, nor is there any pattern of rhyming, not even end rhyme. The poem contains 2 stanzas of 5 lines each. In the first stanza, that line is a complete sentence. However, in the second stanza, there isn't a complete sentence, but a group of phrases or words that the poet makes use of. Now, Whitman is able somehow to make a balance between stanzas 1 and 2 by the utilization of the same concept in both stanzas, which again goes to reiterating the theme that he introduces in this poem. Walt Whitman introduces us to a spider who is about to begin the trickiest and the most difficult part of what is his job, which we can assume is to build a web. At the beginning of this process, the spider has to spin out many strings or threads from out of itself in order to connect with something somewhere. This is the most difficult part of spinning a web. Once the spider has linked that first thread onto some stable spot, he has laid a foundation, and from there on it becomes very simple for the spider to continue to build his web. Now the poet continues in stanza 2 to introduce us to his soul, and he lets us know that this poem is not just about a spider, but it's about some far greater truths of human life. Just like the spider, the soul also sends out many attempts to connect with people and places and things. And all of this, the poet tries to tell us, is his way of combating the extreme loneliness and isolation that creatures, whether they are tiny ones like spiders or more significant ones like human beings, experience in this immense vastness of our world. The spider is being compared throughout this poem to a human soul. Just like the spider makes many attempts to send out filaments from its body in order to cover that vast space and create a home for itself, wherein it can then continue to trap insects that it must feed on, so also the human soul is constantly in the process of making connections or linkages with other people and things. If we consider the journey of a human soul, it is all about building relationships. Everything that human beings are involved in is about linking or connecting to other people. Somehow there is such an overwhelming sense of isolation and loneliness in this world that human beings begin from an early stage of life to try to establish rapport and contact with others. Every human activity is also linked to the same thing if you consider it for a moment. Think about bridges and roads that we build, or methods of transportation, whether they are planes or ships or cars. Every one of them is built by human beings in order to connect with people, to establish that link, and then to nurture it and to grow it, because somehow, somewhere, human beings sense this need to connect in order to validate their own existence in the world. Even though the idea may seem at first to be extremely absurd that a poet should compare a spider of all insects to something as magnificent as the human soul, Whitman is successfully able to draw this analogy. Let's look at his poem and see how far he can draw out this metaphor. A Noiseless, Patient Spider by Walt Whitman. A noiseless, patient spider I marked, where on a little promontory it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant vast surrounding. It launched forth, filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached, in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. In line 1, we are introduced to the noiseless, patient spider. We find out that he is one of the main characters of the poem. If you look at the poem, now that we just read it, the first line is a repetition of the title. That should tell us something. Whenever we want to emphasize something, when we want to convey to somebody that something is very important, we use the tool of repetition. So in repeating in the first line what we already read in the title, that we are going to know right now about a noiseless, patient spider, it's very clear that Whitman wants us to pay attention to something about the character of the spider. We know almost at the end of line 1 that the poet intends for us to keep this spider in mind because it's going to play a very important role in the unraveling of this poem. By the end of line 1, the image of the spider is pretty fairly planted on the mind of the reader. Beyond that, there are certain words that the poet uses which tell us some things about the spider. Words like noiseless and patient. First of all, it's quite probable that the spider does make some noise. But in all probability, that noise is so negligible because the size of the spider is so small. I'm sure that spiders have a spider language which they use to communicate with one another. But because spiders are so tiny, we human beings are unable to hear their language. So the poet assumes that this spider is noiseless. Further, there's no way that we human beings have of knowing whether that spider was patient or not. If we think of the word patient in human terms, we would probably use it to refer to somebody who's happy to wait, someone who will try again until they achieve what they want in life. But we have no idea whether this spider was really one such or not. We can only infer that this is so because in watching the spider make repeated attempts to spin its web, it does exhibit those qualities of patience that we understand it as when we see it in human beings. Therefore, in commenting on the spider in human terms, Whitman is wanting to attribute certain human qualities to the spider. And in doing so, he's making use of a literary device that is very commonly used by poets. And this is the device of personification, wherein a poet gives human qualities to something that's not a human being at all. Again, the poet does this for a very important reason. He wants us to know that this spider is much more than a spider. It is, in fact, working to represent certain qualities about human existence. Whitman has achieved quite a lot in this first line of the poem. Not only has he given us much information about the spider, but he's also helped us to create an opinion about it. And we could find, if we think for a moment, that that opinion is beginning to be quite favorable. The second line is where the poet chooses to make his entry into the poem. He is here in the eye of line 2, marking and noting where on the promontory the spider stood. It's very important that we notice what the poet is doing. He says that he's watching every move that the spider makes. He obviously finds that the spider has chosen a very significant place on which to stand. There seems to be something very strategic about the location of this promontory. A promontory is a ledge or a cliff which overhangs a vast open expanse, either of water or of simply nothingness, and therefore this point is seen by the poet as having a certain meaning. The scene of the poem is set here. We find out that there are two main characters, the spider and the poet. One is being watched while the other is doing the watching. There is also a physical description of the scene which is happening on the edge of a ledge over a vast, huge expanse. So we find out the description and the two main characters in line 2. Line 2 also sets the tone of the poem. Line 2 says that the spider was isolated. This means that it was all alone. Isolated is an extremely strong word, and we are not told why the spider was isolated. It could be that he was rejected. It could be that he took a decision in favor of loneliness. It could be that he was an outcast spider. We don't know, but what we do know at the end of this is that whatever experience the poem is going to describe, the spider has to go through this experience all by himself because he is isolated. And in drawing that comparison to the soul, the poet wants us to understand that our deep life experiences that each one of us must go through will all happen on a one-on-one basis. We have to go through those experiences all alone and isolated from the rest of the connections that we do even successfully make as we travel life's journey. Line 3 tells us that the spider did not jump or rush into this enterprise which we can guess is making a web. He goes about it very thoughtfully, considering all the possibilities, and then only he begins the actual act of trying to spin his web. We get the feeling that we are not dealing here with an ordinary spider, but rather that this spider is standing in for something or somebody else. Having planned sufficiently, lines 4 and 5 tell us how the spider gets filament after filament out of its own body in order to spin that web. The initial attempts of the spider are all unsuccessful. But these are important because he is laying the foundation for the future when it will be easier to spin out those filaments and make those connections. Once the spider has done this, it is a lot easier. If you have never seen a spider spin a web, there are two links that you can follow at the end of the lesson. One shows you an animated version and one is actual film of a spider spinning its web. When we see that spider making repeated attempts to connect his web with something solid, it gives rise to an emotion in us. And this is the emotion of sympathy. We come out of this feeling, oh, poor little spider. This tiny creature in the vast universe has such a difficult task to do. And that's precisely because human beings find the effort of the spider very interesting in that it resembles human effort. Just like the spider, we human beings also have to think, plan, strategize, and then move into different actions. Just the fact that we have done all of these procedures does not mean that when we actually start working, we are going to be successful. Many of our initial attempts would probably break down and collapse, just like the first strings which the spider weaves out of its body. And that's one of the reasons why watching a spider create its web is such an interesting pastime for most human beings. The poet uses the word filament 3 times in order to emphasize the delicate nature of all human effort. Human effort is fragile and prone to be destroyed. No matter how much thought goes into it, or planning, or even effort, there is no guarantee that it will succeed. And so in this respect, human effort can very easily be compared to the work of a spider. Very often you might have noticed that while we people are afraid of spiders, we wouldn't like them to fall on us or to crawl up our back. We are all very interested when it comes to watching them from a safe distance. This is probably because we can so empathize with the spider. There is a point of connect where we can understand the travails and the difficulties that a spider goes through when it's spinning its web. We can fully comprehend how hard it must be for that little spider to make those connections across vast empty spaces, just as it's so difficult for us very often in our relationships and in our linkages with people and things. Some critics have noted the use of piscatorial imagery or symbolism taken from fishing in lines 4 and 5. In particular, the words launched and unreeling are highly suggestive of an angler or a fisherman and the work which they are involved in. Further, to strengthen these images, Whitman makes use of many other nautical symbols like bridge, ocean and anchor, and all of these take us further into that line of thought that perhaps the poet is comparing the work of the spider and the work of all human beings to a fisherman. Again, this is strengthened by the use of filament, because a filament is also that thin line or thread which a fisherman will throw and throw again and throw again until he finds the perfect spot in the water where he can launch his bait in order to catch a fish. In many ways, the work of a fisherman is highly symbolic of the work of all men in general, because a fisherman must be quiet, a fisherman must be patient, he must sit there and just wait until that bait which he has set out there will trap a fish, which will become the reward of his effort. So it's quite probable that these images are deliberately used by Whitman in this particular stanza. The first stanza also bears a very strong resemblance to a 14th century legend of Robert the Bruce, a king of Scotland. The story goes that once when he was defeated in a battle with England, Robert the Bruce took shelter in a cave. He was so discouraged, hiding from the enemy in this cave, when his eyes rested on a little spider who was struggling to build a web from one rafter to the other. Many times the spider fell as his string broke, but undeterred, the spider picked itself up and continued to attempt to build this web over and over. Encouraged by the sight of this spider, King Bruce picked up his courage. He thought that if a spider can do it, surely I can. And from here comes the dictum, if at first you don't succeed, then try and try and try again. So King Bruce picked up his courage, left that cave and went right on into a battle with the King of England, and legend has it that he won that battle. The inspiration for his stick-to-itiveness came from the spider that he met in the web. If you want to know this story in more detail, you can also find it at the end of the notes. In stanza 2, from lines 6 to 10, Whitman extends the metaphor of the spider, although we never see the spider again. The spider is visually absent, yet the emotions that were created in stanza 1 linger on through concepts that the poet continues to follow in stanza 2. Line 6 begins with the poet addressing his soul. "Oh, you, my soul," he says, and this is a huge shift. It comes as a huge shock to the reader because we can sense that there is a very dramatic shift, and at once the reader realizes that all this time the poet has been trying to make us comfortable with accepting the spider as an image for his own soul. Some people find this rather hard to grapple with, but what the poet wants us to do is to see the spider as an image or a metaphor for the human soul. In addressing the spider directly thus, the poet is making use of another very important literary tool, and this is called the apostrophe. It's said the same way as the punctuation mark, but what it means when used in a poem is that the poet is directly addressing something which is not a human being as if it were. Now, the soul is not human, but the poet is directly talking to the soul, and that is what is called an apostrophe. By introducing us to his soul in line 6, Whitman has made a huge jump from a small creature in nature to something as abstract and complex as the soul. Who knows what the soul looks like? In line 6, Whitman says that he sees his soul standing. Does the soul have legs that it can stand? Do we even know what our souls look like? Have we ever even thought about our soul, for that matter, to know what it may possibly look like? Yet here the poet is compelling us to think about these things. It is typical of Whitman that he will move from the small to the significant and back again. And this is his way of showing us that all things in life and in nature are interconnected. However big or small they might be, everything is interrelated in this universe that we live in. This is what Whitman is trying to say through his jumping around from small things to big things. Now, this is exactly where it comes in handy that Whitman has already introduced us to the spider. If we had confronted the poem and Whitman had put his soul in line 1 as standing out there, it would have been really hard for us to digest. But because we have already seen the spider standing there, and by this time we have come to understand that the work of the soul is very much like the work of the spider, it becomes so much easier for us to understand what exactly the soul goes through in terms of what the spider has already experienced in the study that we've done so far. In line 7, Whitman talks about the human soul surrounded by measureless oceans of space, and this immediately takes us back to the isolation and the vastness of the expanse that the spider sees in line 2 of the poem. In line 8, Whitman talks about the human soul musing and venturing and trying to connect with the spheres. Possibly the human soul also thinks a lot about making the future secure by making connections in the present. The spheres that the poet talks about, we have no clue what they mean, but we can guess that they are probably people, because that's the most important connection that we as human beings desire to make and that we enjoy. But in addition to people, these spheres could also represent philosophies, ways of thinking, truths, religion, and even God, because all of these represent links that the human soul desires to make in order to feel secure in itself and in order to validate itself in this time of existence in the world. The bottom line is that whether these connections are with people or philosophies or with God, each of them is a way that the human soul seeks to find to combat the loneliness and isolation that is part of human experience. In lines 9 and 10, Whitman completes the analogy of the spider with the human soul. Just as in the first stanza, he described the many attempts of the spider to link or to connect itself with objects in order to build its web. In the stanza 2, he talks about the human soul and its many attempts to also make a bridge or to connect, even though many of these attempts are ductile, which means they are fragile and delicate. The words which the poet uses all suggest how easily these connections might be broken. Even the word gossamer refers to something very thin and something that's easily snapped. And so again, the poet seems to suggest that all human relationships, all human connections, even though they are wrought with great trouble, although they are difficult to make, you can never be sure about them because at any time they could break or they could crash. Just as the poet emphasized the first link made by the spider in stanza 1 as being foundational to the building of the rest of the web, so also the first link for the human soul is very important for that human being because it works like an anchor or a bridge, and from there the human person feels steadied in this stormy life. Just like an anchor helps a ship to stay stable, so also the links which the human soul makes give stability to the human being, because no matter what situations buffet it about and trouble it in human existence, those connections give that tranquility and stability to the human soul. This is what he brings out in lines 9 and 10. Those relationships, those connections and those linkages are like bridges or like anchors which steady the human soul. In the second stanza, the poet stretches the analogy between the spider and his soul. Like the spider, the soul is surrounded by measureless oceans of space. Like the spider, his soul also wants to make connections with something outside of itself. In both, the poet captures a sense of yearning, a real and a deep desire to connect. Just as the spider wants to throw out silken threads to connect with something solid, the soul wants to throw out a gossamer thread to connect with the spheres. The poet has a desire to link up with something out there in the vast open universe. It is hard to tell what these spheres represent, but they are the objects of the poet's longing. They might stand for people, love, universal truths, or even God. In comparison to the vastness of the universe, the attempts of every creature, whether they be a spider or a human being, to connect with others would seem quite random and an impossibility. However, in this poem, the poet shows us that the spider has gone before in order to show us the way. The way is to be noiseless and patient. The spider never complains and the spider never makes a noise. The spider is extremely enduring and patient. Perhaps Whitman wants to tell us through the example of the spider that when human effort is coupled with uncomplaining endurance, then we will smile and enjoy the accomplishments of what we have endeavored to do in this world. Who would have thought that the poet could use a creepy crawly spider to illustrate the yearnings of the human soul. Yet it is to the credit of Whitman's genius that he has been able to show us the complex, intriguing nature of human relationships and the need to connect and nurture them through the example of this little arachnid. What might have seemed implausible at the start of the poem becomes very convincing as we see it as a rich metaphor to illustrate the undaunted, tireless hope that the spider demonstrates and the continuous effort in spite of the object of that effort being invisible most of the time. In contemplating the poem and its significance, I could not help thinking that if Walt Whitman had been writing the poem in the 21st century, he might have used the World Wide Web as a symbol too. For the World Wide Web is a means of linking people with other people and people with the information they need. The success of social networking websites like Facebook testifies that humans are essentially social beings. Their greatest satisfaction is in linking with other like-minded humans, and every search on a website is the same as the spider throwing out silken threads from its body to make a link, or it is like the soul seeking to connect. What a perfect image of the constant attempts of man to make connections and linkages. The World Wide Web is just another modern means that man has found to overcome the unbearable sense of loneliness that is the common burden of our human existence. Our relatively fragile human existence must find constancy in linkages. Man's resilience and his efforts to survive in this world are demonstrated through his continuous search for meaning through relationships. And this is true whether it is so for the tiny little spider or for the supreme creation of this universe, the human being.